This is The Competitive Edge with Shane Snow. Welcome to The Competitive Edge. My name is Scott Britton, and I'm here to help you answer a question that we all have. How can I get an edge in my business and life? Each week, we're going to uncover how some of the most successful and inspiring entrepreneurs, entertainers, and thought leaders get an edge, so you too can reach your full potential. Thanks for tuning in today. Now let's get started. What is up, Edge Nation? Scott Britton here, coming to you with another episode of The Competitive Edge. Today, we're lucky to have Shane Snow on the show. What do you know? That rhymes, and I didn't even plan that. Shane is the Chief Creative Officer and co-founder of a tech company called Contently. But Shane does a whole lot more than that. He's a journalist who writes for magazines like Wired, The New Yorker, and Fast Company. And he's also writing a book. And why I'm so excited to have Shane on the show today is he's one of these guys who's an expert at working smart, which is how he's able to do all the things that I just mentioned. And he's also the type of person that approaches problems differently. This is one of the ways that he was able to write for such amazing media outlets while running a tech company. Specifically today, we're going to talk about different mindsets that Shane's used, including 10x thinking and progressive access, which we'll be talking about shortly. Without further ado, here's Shane Snow. Shane, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great, and I guess I should tell you, you have a great voice for podcasts. I just thought I'd get that out there first.
Thanks, man. I've been massaging the vocal cords
Nice.
all day, getting ready for this. So, Shane, I usually like to dive into the meat of the content because I feel like a lot of these podcasts, entrepreneurial stories are just a bit played out. But the first time we met, you told me an awesome story about your start into entrepreneurship and a funny story about how you started making money online. And I think it would be cool just to start off by telling that story and just give a brief introduction into how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So the story is that I grew up in Idaho, and I had a couple of friends who were really into computers like me, and we were in the computer club and the math club. And when the internet came to our high school, we started building websites to try and make money online. And one of the things that I did is I built this site that was an online greeting cards, where basically it was someone's birthday. You could find this page on my site that had dancing smiley faces or whatever, animated birthday cake, and you could email that to your friend whose birthday it was. Then I would make advertising money off of the ads that were kind of associated with that. And so what happened is started making some money, and it sort of trickled in at first, and then it started snowballing until one month I got a check that was larger than my dad's paycheck. And my parents suddenly started getting worried about what is this thing that, our son is doing, a 16-year-old son is doing to make money. Like, checks are being sent to him from the internet. And, and the internet was new, and, it was kind of scary, I guess. And so they did this deep dive into what exactly are you doing, and is it legal? And we're nervous about it. And eventually kind of came to the conclusion that it made them uncomfortable enough that I needed to shut the website down. We had this big fight about it, and it's still kind of a sore subject a little bit, I think, with them. But it actually was really motivating for me later on. But so I shut the website down, and it kind of was like, you can't do the internet money-making thing until you move out of the house. And so that kind of planted this fire under me, where after I left home and I went to college, I said, this is what I want to do. I want to prove that I can, make a living for myself and on the internet, and then I can build businesses. And, kind of one of the things that they had said, I remember, is we'd like you to learn the value of hard work. And, I ended up building, like working construction with my dad, doing houses, and working for the gas company. And I hated that. And so I really liked the idea of hard work with your brain, or doing smart work. And so that was kind of all those things sort of, I think, catalyzed in me a desire to do entrepreneurial things and to find smarter routes, I guess, to accomplishing things. And so that kind of led me into my career that's traversed, I guess, technology and also journalism, which is a very entrepreneurial sort of hustle on your own and figure out smart solutions kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I cannot wait to get started talking about some of the hustle moves that you've used to build a name for yourself in journalism and get a lot of amazing stories and very household name magazines and publications. But first, why don't we just tell everyone who's not familiar with Contently exactly what it is?
So Contently is my current business. Started it in 2010, basically as a way to connect journalists who are freelancers with work. We envisioned it as sort of a Match.com. We'd collect data about what you write about and where you've written for and how well it's done, and match you with people who want to hire freelancers. And it's sort of turned into a software company now where we build tools for publishers to help them manage their newsrooms, to manage content marketing. And on the other side, we build free tools for journalists to help them manage their careers. And so that's been going for, over 3 years. We've raised $11 million from investors in total. And we have now coming up on 40 employees and 30,000 journalists and 50 enterprise customers. And so it's this thing that's sort of taken off faster than we thought it would. But my interest in that came from sort of a combining of my passions, which were computer science and technology entrepreneurship, and the field of journalism, which is what I really love: telling stories, telling true stories, finding the interesting stories that are out there and the interesting people in the world who have knowledge to share, and taking that and turning it into information and entertainment and education.
Shane, you mentioned prior to this call that you recently read a book about storytelling and how stories are such an empowering way to communicate a message. Let's riff on that, man. Tell me a little bit more about this new discovery that you just came upon.
Sure. So if you think about it, stories are part of our everyday life, right? Since the beginning, right? And every night we tell ourselves stories all night long when we dream, and we daydream all day long. But even when you sit down, for coffee or for lunch with a friend or a family member, all you're doing is telling stories. You're reenacting the comedies and the dramas of your days. That's all that gossip is, right? You're telling stories. That's what we're doing right now. We're telling stories about, I guess presently sort of my journey. It's the basis of our human interaction. And it's interesting because we all know that, and we all intuitively can tell that that's what builds relationships. But I hadn't really thought about how that is actually a biological thing and sort of a psychological thing until I read this book recently called The Storytelling Animal, which is by an author called Jonathan Gottschall. It was a really good book, and he's a fiction buff. And he originally, it sounds like from reading the book, he set out to kind of show why fiction is important, or is it? But he goes through the science of how humans developed this storytelling capacity in our brains and also this need, and how at the same time that we developed language and logic, we also started telling each other stories. And that was originally, in sort of caveman days, a way for us to package information, like the wide world of stimuli that we had, and be able to present that to others in our tribes to help them sort of learn stuff quickly that they couldn't, learn having been there. But it also had this sort of side benefit of bringing people together, building relationships. So if you think about, people who are very patriotic, one of the main reasons that often we're inexplicably patriotic is we grow up hearing these stories about the noble and heroic efforts of, our forebears, that founded the country. And you hear about how George Washington and his men, nearly froze to death at Valley Forge and had no shoes, and then they went out and bravely fought for our freedom. That story itself is memorable, which is kind of the point of stories, but it also builds a relationship between the storyteller and the story told and the object of the story. So that's what this book is about, and it goes through kind of the biology of how the brain is wired for that and how we succumb to stories. Like if you watch a movie, you've probably had this experience where you're watching a movie and then suddenly there's a noise and you snap out of it and you realize that oh yes, I'm in my living room. That was a truck driving by. But you kind of have this awareness that sort of happened to you where you're like, wow, like I was so absorbed in this movie that I kind of blocked out my surroundings. That's what story can do, which is really fascinating.
It's really interesting to hear that stories are actually something that is like biological in terms of like being able to optimize recall. When I was doing business development and sales, I always used to tell people stories. And when we were describing our product and the use cases of our product, because just to give some actionable insight for listeners here, maybe people in sales, maybe people pitching their companies, a lot of times what would happen is when I was pitching, I'd be pitching someone who would then go back to other members of their team and be responsible for describing our product and service. And I knew that it was much more effective for that person's ability to be able to do that if I told a story instead of just describe the feature. So Absolutely. Like an example is, we provided menu data for publisher websites, and I wanted to display the importance of that. And so instead of just saying, yeah, we have 600,000 menus and it's really important and it's going to drive engagement, the story is, yeah, I was over on this other competitor site.com, and I went there and I couldn't see the menu, and my girlfriend is not happy if we go somewhere and the only thing on the menu is a Caesar salad that doesn't have meat on it. And I'm in the doghouse. So I leave that site and I never go back again because the menu, the thing that I needed to make that decision, wasn't there. And that is like just a way, that's like an example that you're giving someone and a way for them to remember what your service does, besides a bunch of stiff data points that just have no emotional connection.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, when we make decisions between products or the people we'll work with or the companies we want to do business with, all things being equal, the one with the better story is going to be more memorable, and it's going to be, the one we want to do business with. I love this startup here in New York called Zady, Z-A-D-Y. They sell like sustainable fashion and sustainable luxury goods. And what they do is, the example I always use is if you're shopping there and you're looking at skinny jeans, they have these indigo skinny jeans that they sell. And instead of just showing you the product, they actually have this long page of the story of the cute couple in Kentucky that makes these jeans in their garage. And you see pictures of them. It talks about how they met, and you can see pictures of their dog, and they look so happy. And this is their labor of love. And once you read that story, the next time you think you're in the market for indigo skinny jeans, that's the first thing you're going to think of. When you see that next to, whatever, like the jeans in the mall, assuming that price and quality are equal, you're going to pick the one that has the great story. And that's, we don't often consciously, that's really on the nose example, but we don't often consciously do that. But that's why people shop at Whole Foods, right? Is because of the story of, this is organic and this is like good for the world. And like, we care about like all this stuff. This picture that Whole Foods paints makes their product somehow worth more to us than, the tomatoes across the street at the farmer's market in a lot of cases, or at the, the Gristedes.
Absolutely. I also tell myself that I'm healthier when I eat at Whole Foods, regardless of the stuff that I get, which often isn't very healthy. But it has a Whole Foods sticker on it, so I'm safe. One of the things I also wanted to talk about today, Shane, is you've told a lot of other people's stories. I mean, you've written for Wired, Fast Company, some of the biggest publications out there. And I know that this has brought a ton of value to your life. So what I'm curious is first, what are some of the cool opportunities that writing for these publications has brought to your life? And then I want to talk about how you've been able to accomplish that, so people listening who want to get in these mainstream media outlets might be able to do the same.
Yeah. Well, I guess, the first thing is, I love writing and I love, journalism, and part of it is because of that story factor. But I also, I don't know, I find other people's stories more interesting than my own. So I'd rather, write about someone else's success than, write about my own. Just, I don't know, because it's less weird for me, but it's also, I find journalism and writing in general to be an educational experience. You're always learning. And that's the great thing about writing for these places like Wired, is the thing that you get from that name is access. So if I email, and all the time I do this, I'll find out about something interesting, or I'll hear about someone that is doing something cool, or, some new famous person, and I'll actually email them and say, in the subject line, Wired writer interested in talking to you. It gets you such great access. And, I use that to hopefully, get a story in front of my editor. But using that stamp of credibility opens a lot of doors to really interesting people that wouldn't otherwise talk to you, NASA engineers, and trying to think of who,
let's give an example of an interesting person you've been able to invite into your life because of that access?
Well, I recently, it was last fall, the movie Ender's Game was coming out, and so I emailed Orson Scott Card, the author, who's very famous author. He's written 60 books, and Ender's Game is one of those classic books, and he's also very hard to get a hold of. And so I emailed him, saying, I write for Wired, and I'd love to interview you. And the thing that he wrote back is, "You had me at Wired." Like, he literally wrote that. And that was awesome. And so, I got to call him up, and he's a controversial guy, like in his personal life, which, I find fascinating and interesting. But it turns out he's also one of the sweetest guys I've ever talked to. And, we talked for a couple of hours on the phone. Really interesting, told me a lot about Ender's Game, obviously, and about the movie, but also just about like his life and his family. And that's really cool. And it's great to be able to meet people like that and meet your heroes. Right. And then, of course, I wrote about it, and it got published in the magazine. So, being able to bring that kind of access to other people is really, really awesome too. And it's one of those things that builds. So, to your second question, how I got there. So, I haven't been in journalism for that long. I started writing, for my undergrad newspaper, but I wrote humor, and it wasn't really journalism. I really sort of became a journalist, I guess, in 2009 when I ended up at Columbia Journalism School here in New York. That was when I first did real reporting and, learned to be, I think, a real writer. And so if you think about that, that's only 5 years ago. And in that first year, my goal was to write for Wired, which was my favorite magazine. So I did this thing, and I tell this story a lot to freelancers, that the typical path, if you want to write feature stories for a magazine, is you get an internship there, you beat the other 1,000 people who applied for the internship, then you hopefully you work really hard, and you hopefully get a job as they hire you afterwards as some really low level position, like junior fact checker. So basically, you're calling up sources for other people's stories and saying, "Hey, did this reporter talk to you?" Okay, great. And so you get that job, and you work at that for a couple of years, and then eventually they let you write something small. Then eventually you apply for a staff writer job. And you do that for a long time. You kind of write these thankless stories, stories that are not the really great ones that everyone wants, or you hustle, you try and find good stories yourself. And then you sort of climb your way up the ladder over the years until, a feature writer or columnist dies of liver failure. And then if you're the next one in line, then you can get that gig.
It's a lot of ifs.
Exactly. And that's how it works, especially in newspapers, especially in magazines. But what I noticed is that there are a lot of people who are writing feature stories, these big old, impressive stories, who were not on staff in the magazine. These are these freelancers. And so kind of ask the question, how do they get the credibility with the editors to do that? So the thing that I did actually when I first got to J School is I emailed an editor, a features editor at Wired, with a story idea. I was really excited about it. I thought it was a great story. I had great access. And, he wrote back and he said, "Hey, really impressed, really happy for you. But just so you know, we don't assign big feature stories to unknown writers. Come back in a few years when you have experience." And so that got me thinking about what's the minimum required credibility that I would have to have in order to get this guy at Wired to print a story for me. Probably it's to have written for a slightly smaller publication. You're usually willing to take a risk on someone that's one rung on the ladder below. I was like 10 below. So I kind of reconstructed this backwards ladder of like, what are the minimum credibility for each tier to get up to Wired? And I ended up basically choosing what I call now an anti-platform of what's a blog or what's a small publication that's in the vein of Wired, but that's so small that they would print anyone. And it's like desperate for content that, if you give them a good story, they'll go for it. And so I ended up emailing a bunch of these types of blogs that looked desperate, like, one or two people running them, but, wanted to do stuff in the vein of Wired. And so I ended up getting a response from this guy at the Next Web, which is now a pretty big blog, but at the time was, very small. I basically wrote him and I said, "Hey, free story. I have this story idea. I've already written it. I just want my name on it. Are you interested?" And he said, yes. And so, wrote the story for him. I wrote a few stories for him. And then once I felt like I had, like he would say, "Yeah, I know Shane," if someone reference checked me. Then I went to the next tier up, like one shade above the Next Web, and pitched them. And the pitch was, I'm a journalism school student. I've written for the Next Web and I write about technology. Here's a great story that I'd love to pitch you. And so I did that. The next level up at the time was Gizmodo. And so, I pitched an editor at Gizmodo. I wrote a few stories for them. Then I went to the next level up after that, which was Mashable. And the same thing, I said, hey, I met the editor, and I said, I write for Gizmodo and the Next Web, and I'm a journalism school student. I'd love to write stories for you. So that's how I got there. And I wrote several stories as a freelancer. So as a free agent, but I was basically leaning on the brand equity of the other publications. So for Mashable, I had a great relationship with them. I wrote a bunch for them, but I very quickly moved from there to Fast Company, and then from there to Wired. So a Wired editor will look at, this guy's written a bunch of stories for Fast Company. Like, that means that someone has trusted him. It means he knows the topic. We'll give him a shot. So I ended up in 6 months, actually, writing a feature story for Wired. They published it on Wired.com. And that was my foot in the door to get into Wired on the print side, which I now write for every few months. And actually just recently, just this week, I had my first story on the New Yorker.
Nice.
Which is kind of like a great accomplishment for me that, that's one of the top publications. And I got there because of sort of leaning on this credibility of, here are the brand stamps that I have that I've written for, and showing your past work. And so I guess all that's to say, if you're interested in pursuing a career like this and you are willing to treat it like an entrepreneurial thing and hustle, then this sort of sideways ladder climbing thing works really well. You provide value, you hustle, you work. You don't just do one story, but do several until you establish a relationship. And then you use that credibility to go one rung up the ladder as fast as you can.
I may or may not know a guy who's doing that with his podcast right now.
How's it going?
It's going good, man. It's amazing. I found that, and I'll be totally transparent with everybody listening. And because I think this type of framework is universally applicable, whether you're trying to write for publications or you're trying to get on a TV show. I wrote a post about that. Or you're trying to get people on your podcast or even new customers. Starting off, getting one anchor that is like somewhat respected, and then leveling up one person. And then once you have that person's name, you level up again and you continue to get better and better access. And that's totally been the story for me in terms of building out this podcast lineup, which has just been an amazing, series of events that just keeps getting better and better. So I guess I challenge people who are listening to this right now to think about, whether whatever they're trying to accomplish, who is that, if they haven't made any progress, who that initial respectable but low anchor could be that they could then use to get progressive access that's going to open up even more opportunities for them.
I like that term, progressive access. I think I'll steal that.
Yeah, steal that. Put that in the moleskin. So Shane, what I love about your just general approach to your business, to your life, is that instead of trying to be the hardest worker, and I'm not saying you don't work hard, I feel like you have a very focused intention of working smart. And this was just an excellent example of that. Is there any other instances in your business or life where you've taken a counterintuitive approach to something, and it's actually worked out in you achieving what you wanted much faster or much more effectively?
I'll try to think of a good example. So I can back up a little bit and talk a little bit about one of the things that my dad taught me. In addition to building houses and sort of working hard, he did always say, you can work hard and you're going to have to work hard, but the person who works smarter is the one who's going to accomplish more and who's going to win. And so he used this object lesson on my brother and I, where he had like a nail basically in a board that was really hard to pull out. And so he gave us a hammer and he said, try and pull out the nail. And he would he used this object lesson on us a few times. There's a really hard task. You use all your strength, you try to pull it out. It's really difficult. And then kind of with a smile, he brought over like a metal pipe, from the garage, and he's puts it over the handle of the hammer, turns it into a lever. And then when you pull on the end of the pipe, it's much easier, and the nail pops right out. And it's the law of the lever that Archimedes, way back in the day, said that the longer the distance from the fulcrum, the less effort there is to sort of pull to tip something out. And that object lesson basically was that there is an established way to do everything, and a sort of a straightforward way to do everything. And often it's really hard, but there's also ways to multiply the effort that you're doing that you're using so that it's either less hard or so that you get more bang for your buck. And that's not cheating. It's not cheating to make the job of pulling a nail out easier. It's just smart. So I've like that and other objects lessons like that have kind of influenced, I guess, the way that I work. And so, I mean, typically trying to think of a good, not convoluted story in business. And typically the thing that I like to ask myself, and then my partners like to ask ourselves, in our meetings at Contently, is how can we do so what is it that we're doing? And are we doing it just because that's the way everyone else is already doing it? Is there a way for us to do this smarter? And actually, so here's an example. There's this guy at Google who runs Google X named Astro Teller. Really fascinating guy with the greatest name ever.
I was going to say, doesn't sound like a Google X guy.
Yeah. And he, I had a conversation with him recently for something I was writing about what he calls 10x thinking, which is this idea that everyone thinks in terms of like 10% improvements. And it's actually very hard to improve something 10% in a general sense, right? You're trying to make your business 10% better, 10% growth. That's a lot. But his whole philosophy is that if you think about things not in terms of how can we incrementally do better, but what if we had to do this 10 times better? What would you have to do? And that's their whole thing at Google X. They have these like crazy ideas where they're like, let's not just, make Wi-Fi faster. Let's make Wi-Fi faster for the whole world. Let's give free internet to everyone. And that's a crazy idea. But it turns out when you start thinking that way, it forces you to question the assumptions that we make in the course of life and business that often sort of prevents us from doing big things. And so when you tear down those assumptions, you start from scratch. Often you're able to build something more elegant. So we do this thing at Contently where we periodically have these 10x meetings where we ask ourselves, how could we do what we're doing? How could we trade what we're doing for something better? Either 10x better or twice as good. And so what's come out of that, a good example of this is we initially started the business, try not to make this too complex. We initially started the business as kind of this marketplace. So writers on one side, buyers essentially on the other side, publishers paying for writers to do work. Contently makes 15% of that transaction, kind of like eBay or any kind of marketplace. Mm-hmm. The difficult thing with that to grow is we wanted to work with really high-end professional writers who charge a lot of money. Well, it turns out to get publishers to pay the kind of money we wanted to broker, for these writers, there actually has to be some sort of a sales process, some sort of hands-on thing. People don't just sign up for this. And so we had to have salespeople who had to get quotas and had to have commissions. It turns out when you have a salesperson getting commissioned on something where you're making 15% margin, it's really tough to scale a business just because, we make nothing at the end of the day. And so we were thinking about how do we trade this success that we have? And we got a lot of traction. It was like very much revenue, but not much net profit. And so we were asking ourselves, how can we take this and make it, much, much better? How can we trade what we have for something bigger or better? And, the initial idea was, the natural idea would be, well, let's get more transactions. Let's just have more people doing more stuff. And therefore, our tiny couple of percent of profit, that will eventually, mean something when we have huge scale. That turns out that's really hard to do. The other thing that came out of it, though, was, well, what are other ways that we could get, who has the money in this equation? It's not the writers. If journalists are poor, we're trying to make them money. We're trying to help them out. So we can't extract much from them. But these publishers, especially these big brands that wanted to be publishers, they have tons of money. What is it that what else do they have problems with? Where's their willingness to pay? And what are they willing to pay for? And so that got us thinking about basically building software. So we're hooking these brands and these publishers in with access to talent. But they also need workflow tools, and they need help with measuring how their content is doing and things like that. And so we started building software for these guys that we could then sell at 100% profit and charge thousands of dollars a month, for subscriptions. And so we started doing that, and suddenly our business, revenues, of course, increased. We sold, a dozen big brands on our software the month that we started selling it, and then of course we built more and more features. But so our revenue has increased dramatically over the last year. I think in 2013 we had 400% revenue growth, but we had something like 10 times the net profit growth. And so that was just, I guess, a product of us stepping back and saying, the way we're building this, the thing we're doing, we're working really hard. If we just work harder at this same thing, is that going to get us to where we want? What if we had to get 10 times better? What's the smarter thing to do? So I guess that's an example of that.
It's great. There's literally, my brain is exploding right now with different things that I want to talk about and ideas, but it really all stems back to this notion that what we think about and the way that our brain works is it's determined by the questions that we ask ourselves. That's what we focus on. That's what determines whether we're happy or we're sad, whether we think big or we think small. And ultimately, at the end of the day, one of the things that I've learned is you end up where you aim. And so when you have this mindset of thinking 10x, like, how can I make this 10x better? Maybe you will end up 10x better. But even if you only end up 7 or 8x better, you're in a much better place than think about just improving that 1%. And I really, really like this mindset, man. And just another thing for everybody out there who's building software companies and SaaS companies is that this just reminds me of, from my background, is the toughest part is getting that initial buy-in from a large company and getting them comfortable with working with you and getting within their workflow. Mm-hmm. But once you've been able to do that, you can do these things like you're doing, like upsell, like create new products. And guess what? You also have the best place to see what their pains are once you're on the inside. And they'll tell you because you're already providing value for them. So I think this is like an amazing, almost Trojan horse story of just to get a little story in here and to think about this is, just getting in a way by solving an immediate need, and then once you get inside and solve that need, addressing potentially bigger needs that actually are more lucrative for your business.
Yeah, and it's the same thing along the lines of the I'm forgetting the word now, the progressive access. Progressive access. Thank you. Where as a tiny company, and a startup with just a couple of people, it's really hard to convince Coca-Cola and American Express to work with you. But what we did essentially the same thing as with my journalism. We got early customers who were small and willing to try stuff, and we put their logos on our website, and we use that to sell the next tier up. We put their logos on our website, and we use that to sell the next tier up, until 2-year-old company going to Coca-Cola and saying, "Hey, you should use our stuff." We can point to, here's all of the people, one rung below Coca-Cola, and 100 of them that have already trusted this, and it sort of is this proof point, and then that gets us a tiny step in the door, which then allows us to expand and grow bigger within Coca-Cola. And so it's the same concept, just applied, I guess, to selling customers as an unproven product.
Shane, I think we might have just branded a concept on this episode in Progressive Access.
I like it.
I'm pretty fired up about it. So, Shane, I know you have to run, but there's one question that I always like to finish these episodes with. If you had one piece of advice for people out there, maybe they're looking to start a business, they're just looking to get more abundance of the things that they want in their life, what is one way that you could tell them that they could get an edge to do that?
Get an edge to get more abundance of things in their life.
Yeah, that was phrased really bad.
No, it's cool. I mean, there's so much there. Advice. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so a piece of advice that's been really helpful for you in terms of getting more of what you want, being more effective in business and life. I
mean, the short answer, I think, is read and listen to programs like this and read the stories of people who have done this. For me, I always did this entrepreneurial stuff in high school and all of that. But when I was in college, I joined a startup, 2-person startup, where I got to see firsthand how a startup works and how a really great entrepreneur worked. And that totally changed the way that I approached business, and has had a big impact on the stuff that I've done, whether it's journalism, whether it's straight entrepreneurship, because I was able to live that and sort of see the lessons firsthand that other people, this other guy had done. So that I could sort of learn from the lessons and the mistakes and sort of the lack of mistakes that he made and why he did things the way he did. And I think you don't I always recommend to people join a startup before starting a startup if are insecure about how you'll make it work, just so you can see that on the inside. But there's no reason that you have to get a great mentor to mentor you when there's so much out there that you can obsessively learn about the lives of these great people who have done this stuff before. So I would say read biographies and autobiographies of people who are real hustlers or great entrepreneurs, and learn about the way they think and the decisions that they make. That's the most helpful thing, I think, for anyone who's wanting to change the way they approach work.
That's great advice, Shane. If people want to learn more about you and Contently, what is the best place for them to go?
You can learn about me at my website. It's just my name, shanesnow.com. Contently is contently.com. I mean, I think that's probably the easiest way. My contact info is on my website too, and I'm happy to trade stories with readers or with listeners. And point them places.
Shane, I love it, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate all the amazing insight that you provided today.
Thank you, Scott. You're a great host. And looking forward to our next conversation.
Before we finish up with today's Mindshare, I just want to say thanks for listening to another episode of The Competitive Edge. If you enjoyed the ideas in this episode and want access to all the conversations, tactics, and Mindshares we'll be sharing in the future, the best thing you can do is subscribe to The Competitive Edge on iTunes. And while you're there, if you felt like this show has made a positive impact on your day, it'd be great if you could leave us a review on iTunes as well. Now, I know we covered a lot in this episode, and there might be a few key ideas or tools that you want to remember. So we went ahead and compiled all of the notes, links, and even a full searchable transcript of this conversation for you on lifelonglearner.com. That's life-longlearner.com. I also want to give you the details on a cool contest I'm running right now at lifelonglearner.com/fun. By entering the contest, you'll have a chance to win everything from Amazon gift cards to a free month of having your very own dedicated virtual assistant to an opportunity to come and hang out with me and my buds for a few days, where we'll teach you how to create your very own passive income stream. To enter this contest and learn more about everything we're giving away, head on over to lifelonglearner.com/fun. Hey everyone, Scott coming to you with another Mindshare. So I had an interesting thing happen to me the other day. Two of my roommates are coaches. They coach charisma. They coach people on how to get better with girls. Most of their clients are men who just want to be more confident, charismatic dudes that bring the type of people they want into their life. And a lot of the people that they work with are very far away from where they are today. Like these guys have worked on this for 5 years, and some of the guys they talk to are just starting to realize, like, wow, I don't have any of this stuff taken care of, and I really want to. So, an interesting thing about that predicament is that they no longer have the vantage point of their ideal customer to understand, like, what questions they have, what they're going through, like, what are the things, obstacles they encounter, and I've talked to them multiple times about, how I potentially had an interest in teaching guys this, because I've truthfully learned a ton from them. And I'm like, wow, I wish all my friends in New York knew a lot of this interesting stuff around human behavior and social skills. And I didn't necessarily think, though, that I was the right person to write a book about that, because I wasn't at the very top of my field. But what I realized is that I actually might be able to write an more effective piece of literature for a group of people, because I had the proper vantage point to address the obstacles and challenges and things they were facing that the people at the very top of their field don't have. And that to me is just really interesting, because there's a lot of people out there that want to create things and they don't think that they have enough experience or enough credibility to start creating, when in reality, the people that have all those things might be less helpful to the audience that is coming to them. So this is something that's, I think, a pretty empowering thought. It's something that makes me realize that, like, where no matter where you are in your journey, there's people that you can serve, and there's things that you can create, and there's ways that you can create a business out of that. If you just know a little bit more than the person that you're trying to target. And, you actually might be in a vantage point right now where you can actually help the largest percentage of a particular audience. Just something to think about for everyone out there that has been hesitant to create something because they don't think they've done enough. You actually might be in the perfect spot to help a lot of people. So I hope you've enjoyed this Mindshare. Thanks again for listening. It means a lot to me. I really appreciate everyone out there who listens, and I look forward to talking to you soon.